The Battle of Lake Peipus is one of the most unbelievable moments in medieval history, a battle where frozen terrain, brilliant tactics, and nature itself conspired to drown 20,000 armored German knights beneath the ice. In this episode, we uncover how 5,000 Russian warriors, led by a 21-year-old prince, transformed a frozen lake into a mass grave and stopped the Teutonic Order's relentless Eastern Crusade. After the fall of Pskov in 1240, the Teutonic Knights, warriors who had spent decades carving bloody paths through pagan Prussia and the Baltic, turned their iron gaze toward the wealthy merchant republic of Novgorod. These weren't merely soldiers. They were warrior monks, blessed by the Pope, armored in the finest plates Europe could forge, convinced that God sanctioned their conquest of Orthodox Russia. Their Grand Master had a vision. Orthodox Christianity was heresy, Russian lands were ripe for conversion, and the vast territories beyond could be subjugated under the Black Cross banner. Following their capture of Pskov, the knights established fortresses, imposed Latin priests upon Orthodox churches, and prepared for the final prize, Novgorod itself, one of the richest cities in all of Russia, the gateway to limitless expansion eastward. Standing against this armored tide was Alexander Yaroslavich, a prince barely past his 20th year, later immortalized as Alexander Nevsky. 2 years earlier, he had shattered a Swedish invasion force on the Neva River, earning his legendary surname. Now, recalled from exile by desperate Novgorodians, he faced an enemy far more dangerous. The Teutonic Knights had crushed pagan armies for generations. They had siege engines, disciplined formations, and the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They had never lost a major battle in the East. This was far more than a military confrontation. This was a civilizational crossroads, a moment where Orthodox Russia's very existence hung by a frozen thread. A turning point where faith, survival, desperation, and tactical genius collided on the ice of a lake that would become legendary. Losing Novgorod meant losing Russia itself. It meant Orthodox churches burned and replaced with Catholic cathedrals. It meant Russian culture erased, Russian language suppressed, Russian people enslaved under German lords. It meant the extinction of everything that would one day become the Russian nation. Against Alexander's forces stood approximately 20,000 Teutonic Knights and their allied Estonian conscripts, a massive crusading army including elite knight brothers in full-plate armor, Danish auxiliaries, Livonian sword-bearers, and thousands of Estonian infantry pressed in to save us. These warriors had conquered fortress after fortress across the Baltic. Led by the Prince Bishop Herman of Dorpat and various knight commanders, they represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. Their horses were bred for battle. Their armor could turn arrows at 50 paces. Their lances had shattered shield walls from Jerusalem to Riga. They advanced with the absolute confidence of men who had never known defeat in these eastern lands. Against them stood just 5,000 defenders, a composite force of Novgorod professional Druzhina warriors, Alexander's personal guard from Suzdal, volunteer militia from liberated Pskov, and Mongol-trained horse archers from the eastern steppes. They had lighter armor, fewer knights, inferior siege equipment, and a fraction of the numbers. They were outnumbered 4-1. They faced the most feared military order in Christendom. But they had one thing the Teutonic Knights didn't: intimate knowledge of Russian winter's treacherous gifts and a commander brilliant enough to weaponize geography itself. In this detailed narrative, we break down exactly how Alexander transformed disadvantage into devastating victory, how he used reconnaissance to map ice thickness across Lake Peipus, how he positioned archers on the shoreline to create a killing corridor, how he deliberately weakened his center to create a fatal trap, how he exploited the knights' overconfidence in their armor, how April's warming temperatures became a secret weapon, and how frozen water became the perfect execution ground for 20,000 armored men. March 1242. Alexander had spent weeks liberating fortresses the knights had captured, pushing them back toward their stronghold at Dorpat. But he knew a decisive confrontation was inevitable. The Teutonic Order would never accept these defeats. They would gather their full strength and march. So Alexander chose his battlefield with surgical precision. Lake Peipus, a vast frozen expanse along the border between Russian and Estonian territories. Locals called a section of this lake the Raven's Rock for a distinctive boulder formation on the eastern shore. Hey, Alexander would make a stand, but not in the way the knights expected. For 2 weeks, Alexander sent scouts, experienced hunters and fishermen who knew winter ice like farmers know soil, across the frozen lake. They marked areas where ice was thick enough to hold cavalry. They identified zones where springs underneath created thin patches. They noted where snowdrift concealed weaknesses. They observed how April's unseasonable warmth had begun to thaw earlier than usual. This wasn't mere reconnaissance. This was transforming a lake into a weapon. April 5th, 1242. Dawn broke cold but not freezing, temperatures hovering just above the point where ice begins losing integrity. The Teutonic Knights, camped on the western shore, prepared for battle with methodical confidence. They donned their plate armor, each suit weighing 60 to 70 pounds, designed to make its wearer nearly invincible on solid ground. They blessed their weapons. They formed their trademark formation, a massive wedge of heavy cavalry, the boar's head that had shattered every army it encountered. Knights in full plate formed the core. Danish and Estonian troops flanked them. Behind came infantry and crossbowmen. The formation was designed to smash through enemy lines like a steel fist through parchment. Across the ice, Alexander deployed his forces in a formation that looked almost suicidal. His center was thin, barely 2 ranks of infantry with a regular militia. His flanks were hidden behind snow-covered ridges on the shoreline, where his best cavalry and archers waited in absolute silence. To the knights, scanning the frozen battlefield, it appeared that the young Russian prince had made a fatal error. His weak center practically invited the crushing charge that was a knight's signature. The trap was set. The Teutonic knights advanced onto the ice with a sound of thunder, 20,000 men and horses moving in disciplined formation across the frozen surface. The ice held. Their confidence surged. This would be another easy victory, another step toward Novgorod, another triumph of German military superiority. The wedge formation accelerated, lowering lances, building momentum. The weight of that charge was unimaginable. Thousands of tons of steel-armored men and war horses moving at increasing speed, aimed directly at Alexander's weak center. Alexander waited. His center held position, shields locked, deliberately not retreating too soon. The knights had to commit fully. They had to drive deep onto the ice, far from the safe western shore, into the zones his scouts had marked. Every instinct in Alexander's body screamed to call the retreat early, to save his center before the knights' lances struck home. But he waited. Closer. The ground, no, the ice, vibrated with the approaching thunder. Closer. Knights' faces were visible now behind helmet slits, eyes bright with anticipated victory. Closer. Then, the center broke. Not collapsed in panic, but executed a fighting retreat exactly as drilled. They gave ground rapidly but in formation, drawing the knights deeper, away from shore, toward the marked zones. The Teutonic wedge pursued with savage joy. This was the breakthrough they expected. They charged harder, faster, driving their full weight into the pursuit. The entire formation, the full mass of the crusading army, surged onto the central ice field, exactly where Alexander's scouts had identified the most treacherous ice. From the shoreline ridges, Alexander raised his hand, dropped it. The flanks erupted. Thousands of Russian cavalry and Novgorod warriors charged from concealed positions, hitting the knights' exposed sides with devastating force. Simultaneously, archers on the elevated shore positions, safe on solid ground, began raining arrows into a compressed mass of German cavalry. The knights tried to wheel, tried to respond to the flank attacks, but their tight formation became a death trap. Horses reared. Men collided. The disciplined wedge transformed into a compressed, panicking mob. And then the ice spoke. Not a single dramatic crack, but 100, 1,000 smaller ones. Fissures spiderwebbed across the surface. The knights, each wearing 60 to 70 pounds of plate armor, on horses themselves armored, had concentrated their enormous weight on ice already weakened by April warmth and undermined by springs. The constant movement, the panicked wheeling, the attempts to reform, every action stressed the ice further. Sections began to give way. Not everywhere at once, but in patches, in zones, creating chaos and terror. Knights broke through and vanished, the weight of their armor dragging them instantly into freezing water 20 feet deep. There was no swimming in full plate, no chance to remove armor with frozen fingers. Just instant, drowning death in absolute darkness beneath the ice. Horses screamed and thrashed, breaking through, pulling their riders with them. Men tried to run toward shore. Both shores now seemed impossibly distant, and the ice cracked beneath their fleeing feet. Some sections held, creating islands of temporary safety surrounded by black water and broken ice, which only prolonged the agony. Alexander's forces, lighter in position on solid ground or thick ice near shore, pressed the attack mercilessly. Russian cavalry, trained in Mongol tactics, circled the disintegrating German formation, picking off anyone who tried to reach safety. Archers continued their murderous work, targeting commanders, creating more panic, preventing any organized retreat. The Teutonic Knights, Europe's finest heavy cavalry, warriors who had conquered half the Baltic, were being systematically destroyed by a combination of tactical genius and geography weaponized. The sounds were haunting. The crack of ice splitting. The splash of armored bodies hitting freezing water. The muffled screams of men drowning in darkness. The clash of steel where Russian cavalry caught fleeing knights. The panicked whinnying of drowning horses. And beneath it all, the groaning of the ice itself, a deep bass note of nature participating in slaughter. Hermann of Dorpat, the prince-bishop who had led this crusade with such confidence hours earlier, tried desperately to organize a fighting retreat. Small groups of knights formed defensive circles on patches of solid ice, trying to cover each other's withdrawal. But Alexander had anticipated even this. His cavalry harried every group, preventing consolidation, driving them toward weaker ice. Russian infantry moved onto the battlefield now, finishing wounded knights, capturing those who surrendered, stripping armor from the dead. By midday, 5 hours after battle began, it was over. The ice field was a nightmare landscape of broken surface, floating bodies, abandoned weapons, and red-stained snow. Of the 20,000 knights and allies who had confidently marched onto Lake Peipus that morning, more than 500 noble knights lay dead, drowned, killed in combat, or frozen. Thousands more Estonian conscripts perished. Contemporary Russian chronicles claim thousands drowned when the ice gave way. Modern historians debate exact numbers, but all agree the casualties were catastrophic for the Teutonic Order. The chronicler records that for days afterward, bodies continued floating to the surface as the ice melted. 50 knights were captured, an unprecedented humiliation for an order that rarely surrendered. The Russian forces suffered minimal casualties, perhaps several hundred killed or wounded, primarily from the center formation that had absorbed the initial night charge. Alexander himself was uninjured, though he had fought in the thick of combat, his presence rallying his warriors at critical moments. His tactical gamble, risking his center, trusting the ice reconnaissance, timing the flank attacks perfectly, had achieved what seemed impossible hours earlier. Alexander pursued the shattered remnants back toward Estonian territory but did not overextend. He understood that destroying this army was sufficient. The Teutonic Order immediately sued for peace. Within weeks, they abandoned all Russian territories they had occupied, withdrew from Pskov, and renounced all claims to Novgorod. The treaty signed that summer essentially ended German eastward expansion for generations. The crusading momentum that had seemed unstoppable crashed to a halt on the ice of Lake Peipus. The strategic consequences echoed across Europe. The Teutonic Knights, previously viewed as invincible eastern conquerors, had been comprehensively defeated by a people they considered backward. The myth of German martial superiority shattered like the ice. Orthodox Russia, which had seemed on the verge of extinction, pressed by Mongols from the east, Swedes from the north, Germans from the west, had secured its western frontier. Alexander Nevsky became a legendary figure, a saint in Orthodox Christianity, the symbol of Russian resistance against Western aggression. But the tactical lessons were equally profound. The Battle of Lake Peipus demonstrated that heavy cavalry, the dominant military technology of the medieval period, had critical vulnerabilities. Armor that made warriors invincible on solid ground became a death sentence on weak ice. It showed that terrain knowledge could overcome technological superiority. It proved that unconventional battlefields, frozen lakes, marshes, mountains, could neutralize advantages in equipment and numbers. Military strategists across Europe studied this battle, though few had the opportunity to replicate its unique circumstances. The battle entered Russian cultural memory as a defining moment. Centuries later, Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein immortalized it in his 1938 film Alexander Nevsky, using the battle as allegory for contemporary resistance against German invasion. The image of armored German knights drowning beneath cracking ice became a powerful symbol of hubris defeated by cunning, of nature allied with defenders against invaders, of Russia's ability to absorb and defeat seemingly superior Western armies. The phrase, "whoever comes to us with a sword will die by the sword," attributed to Alexander after the battle, became a Russian proverb. The Battle of Lake Peipus is more than a military engagement won through tactical cleverness. It is a demonstration that geography, weather, and terrain knowledge are weapons as powerful as steel when wielded by brilliant commanders. It shows that smaller forces can overcome overwhelming odds through preparation, patience, and the courage to execute high-risk strategies. It reveals how overconfidence and technological superiority can become fatal liabilities when facing enemies who understand their homeland's hidden advantages. Feel the ice crack beneath steel boots. Witness the moment confidence transforms into terror. Hear the muffled screams of warriors drowning in darkness, dragged down by the very armament to protect them. This is history not as distant chronicle but as visceral experience, where a 21-year-old prince used a frozen lake to drown an empire's ambitions. Welcome to our channel where history comes alive.